Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we begin at the very beginning. Before kingdoms rose, before prophets spoke, before the floodwaters came and the seas parted, there was only God, and the word he spoke into darkness. This is the story of creation and covenant, of faith, failure, and the promise that never left. So get comfortable. Let your mind grow still. Let the sound of rain calm your thoughts, and come with me now as we journey into the Old Testament. Chapter 1. In the beginning there was only God. No stars, no sun, no sea, just a still, silent void. But God was there. His spirit hovered over the deep, dark waters. Then God spoke. With power and intention, he said, "Let there be light." And at his word, light broke forth, bright, brilliant, and full of promise. God saw that the light was good. He separated it from the darkness, naming the light day and the darkness night. And so evening passed and morning came the very first day. On the second day, God created the sky. He placed a great expanse between the waters, some above, some below. This sky, stretched out like a canopy, would one day hold clouds, winds, and rain. And God called the sky heaven. It was good. The third day arrived. God gathered the waters under the sky into one place so that dry land could appear. He called the dry land earth, and the gathered waters he named seas. Then he spoke again, and the earth responded. Grass sprouted, plants unfurled their leaves, and fruit trees blossomed, each bearing seeds to grow and multiply. And God saw that it was good. On the fourth day, God placed lights in the heavens. A greater light, the sun, to govern the day. A lesser light, the moon, to rule the night. Stars were scattered across the sky like diamonds, guiding seasons, days, and years. Their beauty and purpose pleased God. It was good. Then came the fifth day. God filled the waters with life. Fish darted through the seas. Great whales moved silently beneath the waves. He filled the skies with birds, soaring and singing, their wings outstretched in joyful flight. Every color, every sound, every creature was crafted with care. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply." And he saw that it was good. On the sixth day, God turned to the land once more. He created animals of every kind, livestock, wild beasts, and creeping things. Elephants trumpeted, foxes darted through brush, and ants built tiny kingdoms underground. The earth was alive, teeming with movement and sound. And God saw that it was good. But there was still one final masterpiece to create. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And so, from the dust of the earth, God formed a human being. He shaped him with his own hands, carefully, purposefully, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The man became a living soul. This being was unlike anything else in creation. He bore God's image, not in appearance, but in spirit, in reason, in the ability to love, choose, and create. His name was Adam, and God blessed him with dominion over all living things. God looked upon everything he had made, the heavens, the earth, the seas, the creatures, and now mankind. And he saw that it was not just good, it was very good. The beauty of the world reflected the beauty of its creator. Then came the seventh day. God rested from his work, not because he was weary, but because creation was complete. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy, a sacred pause woven into the rhythm of life. Time itself now flowed forward. Day followed night. Life breathed and grew. The stars continued to shine, and the earth turned quietly beneath them. All was as it should be, and Adam stood at the threshold of something entirely new. He had breath in his lungs and purpose in his heart. What lay ahead would unfold in a place of perfect beauty, a garden crafted by the very hand of God. And that is where the next chapter begins. Chapter 2. The Garden of Eden, Adam, Eve, and the Fall. After forming Adam from the dust and breathing life into him, God placed him in a special place, a garden unlike any other. It was called Eden, rich with rivers, trees of every kind, flowers blooming in perfect color, and creatures living in harmony. Eden was a paradise, not just of beauty, but of purpose. God gave Adam a role to tend and care for the garden. In the center of Eden, God planted two important trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Of every tree in the garden, Adam could eat freely, except from this one. God warned him, "In the day you eat of it, you will surely die." It was not a trap, but a choice, a boundary of love, offering Adam the freedom to trust. Yet, God saw that it was not good for man to be alone. And so, from Adam's side while he slept, God formed a woman, Eve. She was not lesser, but equal, created with the same breath of life, the same dignity, the same divine image. When Adam awoke and saw her, he rejoiced. "This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Together, they lived without shame or fear. They walked with God in the cool of the day. Their hearts were open, their lives untouched by sin or sorrow. Eden was not just a place, it was a relationship, a perfect connection between Creator and creation. But something dark was waiting to whisper doubt. A serpent entered the garden, cunning and sly. He spoke to Eve not with force, but with a question. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree? With subtlety, he twisted the truth, planting seeds of confusion. Eve replied, explaining that only one tree was forbidden, and if they touched it, they would die. "You will not surely die," the serpent said. "God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like him, knowing good and evil." The words stirred something in Eve, a desire to understand, to grasp more, to become something greater. She looked at the fruit. It was beautiful, and the lie seemed believable. She took it, ate it, and gave it to Adam, who was with her, and he ate too. In that moment, something shifted. Their eyes were opened, but not in the way they expected. Shame crept in like a shadow. They realized they were naked, exposed, vulnerable. They quickly sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves, hoping to hide the uncomfortable truth. Then came the sound, the voice of God, walking in the garden. And for the first time, instead of running toward him, they hid. "Where are you?" God called, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted them to see where their hearts had gone. Adam confessed, and the truth came spilling out. God's heart was grieved. The harmony of Eden had been broken. He spoke first to the serpent, declaring that one day, the offspring of the woman would crush his head, though the serpent would strike his heel. Then, to Eve, he spoke of pain in childbirth and desire distorted. To Adam, the ground would now resist him. His work would become toil. Sin had brought separation. The consequences were real. And yet, even in this, God showed grace. He made garments for them, clothing of skins, and dressed them himself. A covering, both literal and symbolic, of his continued care, even in the face of failure. But they could not stay in Eden. To protect them from eating the tree of life and living forever in brokenness, God sent them out. He stationed cherubim and a flaming sword at the garden's entrance, not as cruelty, but as mercy. Eden would remain sealed until redemption would make a way back. Adam and Eve stepped into a world now changed, one that would carry the weight of their choice. But God did not abandon them. His story would continue. Through pain, through generations, through promise, the journey of salvation had begun. What was lost in Eden would one day be restored. But for now, the garden was quiet, and humanity walked forward, not alone, but watched over, loved, and pursued by the one who still whispered their names. Chapter 3. The first family, Cain, Abel, and early generations. After their departure from the garden, Adam and Eve began their new life outside of Eden. The land was unfamiliar, wild, and untamed. But even in their exile, God did not abandon them. He clothed them, watched over them, and gave them the gift of family. In time, Eve gave birth to their first son, and she named him Cain. Later, she bore another son, Abel. Cain became a farmer, working the soil with his hands, growing crops from the earth. Abel, on the other hand, was a shepherd, tending gently to his flock of sheep. Both brothers brought offerings to God, Cain from the fruits of the land, and Abel from the firstborn of his flock. But God looked with favor on Abel's gift, for it was offered with a sincere and humble heart. Cain, seeing this, was overcome with jealousy. His heart, instead of softening, grew bitter. God spoke gently to him, warning him, "Why are you angry? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" But sin was crouching at Cain's door, and he did not resist it. One day, out in the field, Cain lured his brother away, and in a fit of rage he struck Abel down. The earth drank the blood of the innocent, and for the first time in creation, a human life was taken by another's hand. God called to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain replied, "Am I my brother's keeper?" But God knew, and with great sorrow, he told Cain that Abel's blood cried out from the ground. As punishment, Cain was cursed to wander the earth, a restless traveler. Yet, even then, God placed a mark on Cain to protect him from harm, showing mercy in the midst of judgment. Adam and Eve mourned deeply for Abel, but in time, they were blessed with another son, Seth. Through him, the promise of God's plan would continue. The scriptures say, "At that time people began to call on the name of the Lord." It was a new beginning, a seed of hope planted in sorrow. As generations passed, the earth filled with people, sons and daughters, communities and families. Some chose paths of righteousness, walking in reverence toward God. Others turned toward violence and selfish ambition. The human story was unfolding, full of complexity, both beautiful and broken. Among the descendants of Adam was a man named Enoch, who walked so closely with God that one day, he simply was no more, for God took him. His life became a symbol of deep, personal relationship with the Creator, even in a fallen world. Meanwhile, cities began to rise, and culture began to grow. Instruments were crafted, livestock multiplied, and people learned to forge tools of bronze and iron. Humanity was advancing, but so too was corruption. The hearts of many drifted further from their Maker. The line of Seth remained a quiet thread of faithfulness, a contrast to the loud, chaotic world taking shape around them. Through this line, the story of God's redemption would continue to move forward, step by quiet step. As the population grew, so did the brokenness. The sons of God took wives from among the daughters of men, and with each generation, the earth became more filled with violence and pride. But God was watching, patient, yet grieving. Though sin had entered the world, and humanity's path often bent away from truth, the heart of God remained steadfast. He was already preparing the next chapter, one of judgment, yes, but also one of salvation. And so, from the story of two brothers, one faithful and one fallen, we begin to see a pattern that would echo throughout all of history. The struggle between good and evil, the weight of choice, and the mercy of God, even in our worst moments. This was the beginning of the human family, a story of life, death, and the hope that one day redemption would come. Chapter 4. Noah and the Great Flood, a world washed clean. Generations passed after Adam and Eve left the garden, and the earth filled with people. Yet with their growing numbers came growing wickedness. Violence and corruption became the language of the world, and hearts turned away from God. The beauty of creation was drowned in selfishness and cruelty. But there was one man who still walked with God, who listened to his voice and followed his ways. His name was Noah. One day, the voice of God came to Noah, heavy with sorrow yet filled with purpose. "The earth has become full of violence," God said, "and I will bring an end to all this corruption. But you, Noah, have found favor in my eyes. Build an ark of wood, a great vessel, for I am going to send a flood to cleanse the earth. You and your family will be safe inside." Noah listened carefully as God gave him instructions. The ark would be massive, 3 stories high, long as a field, strong enough to endure the storm to come. It was to be coated inside and out with pitch, so the waters would not breach its walls. God promised that in this great boat, Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives would find refuge. Noah began his work in obedience. Day after day, his hammer echoed through the land. Neighbors and strangers gathered, mocking him. They laughed at the very idea of a flood. "Where is the rain, old man?" they taunted. But Noah did not stop. His hands worked, and his heart prayed. Years passed, and the enormous ark began to take shape. Wooden beams rose against the sky, forming a vessel unlike anything the world had ever seen. As the final planks were set in place, a new wonder began. From hills and forests, deserts and plains, animals came, pairs of every kind. Small and large, timid and fierce, walked or flew toward the ark. It was not Noah who gathered them, but God himself who called them. The people who had once mocked him now stared in awe as the creatures filled the ark. Elephants lumbered up the ramp. Birds fluttered in, their wings bright against the gathering clouds. Lions, deer, bears, and sheep all made their way inside, as if they knew their refuge was there. At last, the day came. God told Noah to gather his family and bring them into the ark. As they crossed the threshold, the skies darkened. And when they were all inside, it was not Noah who closed the massive door. It was God. The door shut with a sound that silenced the world. The first drops of rain fell, slow and cold. Then came the downpour. Water gushed from the heavens and burst from the deep places of the earth. Rivers overflowed, lakes swelled, and soon the dry land disappeared beneath the rising flood. The laughter of mockers turned to cries of fear. Inside the ark, Noah and his family could hear the roar of the storm. The waters lifted the ark, carrying it above the destruction. For 40 days and nights, the rain fell without pause. The waves crashed and the winds howled, but the ark did not break. It was held safe in the hands of God. When the rain finally ceased, the world outside was silent. The waters covered everything. Mountains, trees, and valleys were gone. Only the ark floated on the endless waters. Time passed slowly, but God had not forgotten Noah. A wind began to blow, and little by little the waters started to recede. At last, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Months later, the tops of the mountains appeared. Noah opened a window and sent out a raven, then a dove, to see if the earth was dry. When the dove returned with a fresh olive leaf in its beak, Noah knew the world was being renewed. Finally, God spoke. "Come out of the ark, you and your family, and all the animals with you. Fill the earth again." And so they stepped out into a world washed clean. The air smelled of fresh earth. It was quiet, but it was new. Noah built an altar and offered a sacrifice to the Lord. His prayer rose into the sky with the smoke, and God made a covenant with him. Never again would he destroy all life with a flood. As a sign of this promise, God placed a rainbow across the sky. Its colors stretched wide over the mountains, a reminder of mercy and grace. And from that day on, whenever the rainbow appears, it speaks of God's faithfulness. A new beginning for a world that had been given another chance. And so Noah's story became a story of rescue, a story of obedience, and above all, a story of hope that even in the darkest times, God provides a way. Chapter 5. The Tower of Babel, a divided people. After the floodwaters had receded and the ark had come to rest, the earth slowly filled with life again. Noah's family grew, and over generations, their descendants spread out from the mountains into the wide, open plains. The people all spoke the same language, and there was unity in their speech and work. Wherever they traveled, they worked together, building homes and planting fields, bound by the same words and understanding. As they journeyed eastward, they came to a broad, flat land called Shinar. There they decided to settle. It was a fertile plain, good for crops and safe for families. Life became easier, and in that ease, a new desire began to grow in their hearts. The people looked at one another and said, "Let's make bricks and bake them hard. Let's build for ourselves a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens, so we can make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth." With one language and one purpose, they began to work. Brick by brick, the city rose, and in its center, the tower began to stretch upward. Day after day, the sound of labor filled the air. Clay being shaped into bricks, fires baking them solid, and scaffolds climbing higher and higher. The people were determined, but their dream was no longer about building homes or shelter. This tower was different. It was a monument to themselves. They wanted to rise up to heaven by their own strength. They wanted to be remembered, not for God's glory, but for their own. Pride began to shape their work as much as clay did. Their voices, once united in gratitude, now spoke only of their own greatness. They believed they could reach heaven, that they could stand equal with the God who had saved them generations ago. From the heavens, the Lord looked down at their city and their tower. He saw how close they had become, but he also saw what their unity had begun to create, a pride that would lead to ruin. God knew that with this kind of prideful ambition, nothing good would come. So the Lord decided to act. If they all speak one language, nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their speech, so they will not understand each other. The next morning, as the sun rose and work began, a strange thing happened. Workers called out for more bricks, but their neighbors could no longer understand them. What had once been clear became a tangle of unfamiliar sounds. One group shouted in one tongue, another in another, and confusion spread like wildfire. The sounds of building soon turned into the sounds of frustration. They tried again and again to speak, but the words no longer connected. The work stopped. Bricks were dropped. Tools were left behind. The tower, once a symbol of their pride, now stood half-finished, a monument to their confusion. Families began to drift away from each other, seeking those they could still understand. Some traveled north, others south, some to distant mountains, and others to the coastlines. Groups that once had been united now scattered across the earth. The city was left behind, and the great tower was never finished. It became known as Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. What had started as one people with one voice had been divided by the will of God. And so humanity spread out, just as God had intended from the beginning, to fill the earth, to tend it, and to remember that all their strength and wisdom came from Him, not from themselves. The tower remained behind as a silent reminder that pride leads to division, and that no monument built for the sake of man's name can stand against the purpose of God. Even as they scattered, God's plan continued. Though the people were divided in language, His promise to guide, to watch, and to one day bring redemption was not broken. And the story of the Tower of Babel echoed through the generations, teaching them and teaching us that true greatness comes not from climbing upward to heaven, but from walking humbly with the one who made it. Chapter 6. Abraham's Promise, Faith, and the Stars. From the scattered nations after Babel came a man named Abram, living in the city of Ur. Life in Ur was rich and full of idols, but one voice rose above all the noise, the voice of the Lord. One day, God spoke to Abram and said, "Leave your country, your family, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and through you, all families on earth will be blessed." Abram was 75 years old when he heard this call. It was a promise that seemed impossible. He and his wife Sarai had no children. Yet, despite not knowing where he was going, Abram believed God. He gathered his household, packed his tents, and set out for the land of Canaan, trusting the voice that called him. As Abram traveled, God's presence guided him. Wherever he stopped, he built an altar and called on the name of the Lord. Though the land was already inhabited by others, God whispered to him, "To your offspring I will give this land." The journey was long, but the promise stayed close in Abram's heart. Years passed, and still there were no children. One evening, God came to Abram in a vision. He reassured him, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward." Abram spoke honestly, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" God brought Abram outside beneath the vast night sky. The heavens were brilliant with stars, uncountable and endless. And the Lord said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if you can. So shall your offspring be." In that moment, Abram believed the Lord, and God counted that faith as righteousness. The years rolled on, and still there was waiting. Abram and Sarai tried to understand how God's promise would happen. They made mistakes, taking matters into their own hands, but God remained faithful, even when their trust faltered. When Abram was 99 years old, God appeared to him again and renewed his covenant. He changed Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of many nations, and Sarai's name to Sarah. God promised that within a year, Sarah would bear a son. It seemed too much to hope for, yet Abraham bowed to the promise. Not long after, 3 visitors came to Abraham's tent. They told him that Sarah, though old, would have a child. Sarah laughed at the thought, but God reminded them, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" And sure enough, a year later, Isaac was born, and Abraham's laughter became joy. Isaac was the fulfillment of years of waiting, the miracle of a promise come true. Abraham loved his son deeply, but God had another test ahead, one that would stretch his faith to its very limit. One day, God spoke again, "Abraham," and Abraham answered, "Here I am." The Lord said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." With a heart full of trust, Abraham obeyed. For 3 days, he walked with Isaac and 2 servants, carrying wood for the sacrifice. On the 3rd day, he left the servants behind and climbed the mountain with his son. Isaac asked, "Father, where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham replied, "God himself will provide the lamb." At the top, Abraham built an altar and laid the wood in place. With trembling hands, he bound Isaac and placed him on the altar. As he reached out with the knife, a voice from heaven called out, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. He took the ram and offered it instead of his son. That place was called "The Lord Will Provide." For God had shown once more that his plan was good. Because of Abraham's faith, God reaffirmed his promise. "Through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." As Abraham and Isaac walked down the mountain, the stars overhead seemed brighter than ever. Those same stars had once been a promise. Now they were a reminder that faith in God, even when the path is unclear, always leads to his perfect plan. And so Abraham's story became a story for all generations, of trust, of covenant, and of the God who calls his people to look up at the stars and believe. Chapter 7. Isaac and Jacob, the generational blessing. Isaac, the long-awaited son of Abraham and Sarah, grew up knowing that his very existence was a promise kept. His childhood was marked by the stories of God's faithfulness, how the Lord had given his parents a son when all hope seemed gone. Isaac became the living sign of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. When Isaac came of age, Abraham's servant was sent on a long journey to find a wife for him. After much prayer, the servant was guided by God to Rebekah, a kind and beautiful young woman from Abraham's family. She willingly left her home to travel to Canaan, and there she became Isaac's wife, carrying forward the story of the promise. For many years, Isaac and Rebekah had no children, but they prayed to the Lord. God heard their prayers and Rebekah conceived. Yet even in the womb, there was a struggle, for she was carrying twins. The Lord spoke to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came, the first child was born red and covered in hair, and they called him Esau. His brother followed, grasping Esau's heel as if to hold on to him, and they named him Jacob. From the beginning, the lives of these two brothers were intertwined in a story of rivalry and destiny. As the boys grew, they were very different. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was quieter, preferring to stay near the tents. Isaac loved Esau, for he enjoyed the game his son brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. One day, Esau returned from hunting, exhausted and hungry. Jacob had been cooking a stew, and Esau begged for some. Seizing the moment, Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright first." Carelessly, Esau replied, "What good is a birthright to me if I am starving?" And so he swore an oath, selling his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew. Years later, when Isaac was old and his eyes had grown dim, he prepared to bless his eldest son, Esau. Rebekah, remembering God's words that the older would serve the younger, helped Jacob disguise himself. Jacob put on Esau's clothes and covered his hands and neck with goat skins so that he would feel like his brother. Jacob brought food to his father, pretending to be Esau. Isaac, though uncertain, felt the roughness of Jacob's hands and smelled the scent of Esau's garments. And so he blessed him, giving him the promise meant for the firstborn. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness. May nations serve you, and may your mother's sons bow to you." When Esau discovered what had happened, he wept with anger. Though he would later receive a blessing of his own, the covenant blessing had already been given to Jacob. Esau vowed to kill his brother, and so Jacob fled to the home of his uncle Laban to escape his wrath. On his journey, Jacob stopped for the night and lay down to sleep with a stone for a pillow. That night he had a dream. He saw a stairway resting on the earth, its top reaching to heaven, and angels ascending and descending upon it. At the top stood the Lord, who said, "I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land where you lie I will give to you and your descendants. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go." When Jacob awoke, he was filled with awe. "Surely the Lord is in this place," he said. He set up the stone as a pillar and called the place Bethel, meaning house of God. There he made a vow, "If God will be with me and watch over me, the Lord will be my God." Jacob spent many years in the household of Laban. There he married and had children, and his family grew. Though his life was marked by struggles, deception, and lessons learned, God's hand remained on him. Years later, Jacob returned to Canaan. On the night before he faced Esau again, Jacob wrestled with a mysterious man until daybreak. In the struggle, Jacob refused to let go until he received a blessing. The man touched Jacob's hip, wounding him, but he blessed him, saying, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." When morning came, Jacob met Esau, uncertain of what awaited him. To his surprise, Esau embraced him. The old anger melted away, and the two brothers were reconciled. Jacob, now Israel, carried forward the covenant blessing, and his 12 sons would become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Through Isaac and Jacob, the promise God made to Abraham continued, moving closer and closer to the fulfillment of his great plan. And so the story of the promise lived on, not because of perfect people, but because of a perfect God who keeps his word. Chapter 8. Joseph's Journey, Dreams, and Deliverance. Joseph was the beloved son of Jacob, born to him in his old age and to his beloved wife Rachel. Because of this special love, Jacob gave Joseph a richly ornamented robe, a long coat of many colors that set him apart from his brothers. But this gift stirred jealousy and resentment among them. Joseph was a dreamer. One night, he dreamed that he and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in a field, and suddenly his sheaf rose up while their sheaves gathered around and bowed down to it. When he told them this dream, their anger deepened. Another dream followed. This time the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. Even his father rebuked him, wondering what it could mean. Jealousy turned into hatred. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers in the fields. When they saw him coming, they conspired against him. "Here comes that dreamer," they whispered. "Let's kill him and see what becomes of his dreams." Reuben, the eldest, tried to protect him. "Don't kill him," he said. "Throw him into this empty pit instead." His plan was to rescue Joseph later. So when Joseph reached them, they tore off his beautiful robe and cast him into a dry cistern. While they ate nearby, a caravan of traders came along on their way to Egypt. Judah suggested a different plan. "Why kill him? Let's sell him to these traders." And so, for 20 pieces of silver, Joseph was sold. His brothers dipped his robe in goat's blood and brought it to their father. Seeing it, Jacob believed a wild animal had devoured Joseph. His grief was so deep that no one could comfort him. Joseph was taken to Egypt and sold as a slave to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. But even in a foreign land, the Lord was with him. Joseph worked faithfully, and everything he touched prospered. Potiphar trusted him completely and put him in charge of his entire household. Yet trouble soon found him. Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of wrongdoing when he refused her advances. Her lie led to his imprisonment, but even in prison, God's favor rested on him. The warden placed Joseph in charge of the other prisoners because of his integrity. In the prison, Joseph met 2 of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker. Each had a troubling dream. Joseph listened carefully and, with God's help, interpreted them. He told the cupbearer that he would be restored to his position and the baker that he would be executed. And events unfolded exactly as he said. 2 years passed. Then Pharaoh himself had dreams that none of his wise men could interpret. 7 fat cows were devoured by 7 thin ones, and 7 healthy heads of grain were swallowed by 7 thin ones. The cupbearer remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him. Joseph was brought from the prison, and Pharaoh said, "I have heard you can interpret dreams." Joseph replied, "I cannot, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." With God's wisdom, Joseph explained that the dreams foretold 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of severe famine. He advised Pharaoh to store up grain during the plentiful years. Pharaoh was impressed. Seeing God's spirit in Joseph, he made him second in command over all Egypt. Joseph, once a slave and prisoner, now wore royal robes and a gold chain, and all of Egypt bowed before him. When the famine came, it spread even to Canaan. Jacob sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain, not knowing they would stand before Joseph. They did not recognize him, but he knew them. After testing their hearts and seeing their change, Joseph revealed himself. In tears, he embraced them. "I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. But do not be afraid. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to save many lives." He sent for his father, and the entire family moved to Egypt, where they were given the best of the land. What began with betrayal ended in forgiveness. Through Joseph's suffering, God brought deliverance, not only for his family but for many nations. Joseph's story is a reminder that even in the darkest valleys, God is at work, weaving threads of redemption through pain, guiding his people to a future they cannot yet see. Chapter 9. Moses and the burning bush I call to lead. Many years after Joseph's death, a new Pharaoh arose in Egypt, one who did not remember Joseph and the good he had done for the land. As the descendants of Jacob grew into a great nation, the Egyptians began to fear them. Pharaoh enslaved them, forcing them to build cities and work in harsh conditions, and when even that did not slow their growth, he gave a terrible command. Every baby boy born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile. In those dark times, a Levite woman gave birth to a son. She hid him as long as she could, but when it became too dangerous, she placed him in a basket coated with tar and pitch and set it among the reeds by the river. His sister, Miriam, watched from a distance, her heart pounding as the current carried him slowly away. God's hand was on that tiny basket. Pharaoh's own daughter came to the river to bathe and noticed the basket among the reeds. Opening it, she saw the crying baby and was moved with compassion. "This must be one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Just then, Miriam stepped forward with courage. "Shall I find someone to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and so the baby's own mother was brought to care for him until he was old enough to return to the palace. Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Moses grew up in Pharaoh's household, surrounded by the wealth and knowledge of Egypt. Yet deep in his heart, he knew he was a Hebrew. One day, as a young man, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Anger surged through him, and in a rash moment, he killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, he tried to intervene when two Hebrews were fighting, but one of them said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you did the Egyptian?" Fear gripped Moses. When Pharaoh heard of what had happened, he tried to kill him. So Moses fled Egypt, leaving behind the life he had always known. He traveled far into the desert and came to the land of Midian. There, he sat by a well and came across the daughters of a Midianite priest named Jethro, who were being harassed by shepherds. Moses stood up for them, drove the shepherds away, and helped water their flock. In gratitude, Jethro invited him into their home, and in time Moses married one of his daughters, Zipporah. For 40 years, Moses lived a quiet life in Midian, tending sheep in the wilderness. It was a far cry from the courts of Egypt. Perhaps he thought that his story was over, that his chance to make a difference had passed. But God had not forgotten him. One ordinary day, while leading his flock to the far side of the desert, Moses came to Mount Horeb. There, he saw something extraordinary. A bush engulfed in flames, but it was not burning up. The sight drew him closer, curiosity tugging at his heart. When the Lord saw that Moses had come near, he called out from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" And Moses replied, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed, trembling. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At these words, Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them and to bring them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses' heart pounded. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" he asked. And God answered, "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship me on this mountain." Moses hesitated, still afraid. "Suppose I go, and they ask me, 'What is his name?' What shall I tell them?" God said, "I am who I am. Tell them, 'I am has sent me to you.'" It was a name that carried eternal presence and power. And so, the man who once fled Egypt as a fugitive was called to return, not in his own strength, but with the promise that the living God would go with him. The journey of Moses and the deliverance of a nation was about to begin. Chapter 10. The Exodus, Freedom from Egypt. When Moses returned to Egypt, his heart trembled, yet God's voice gave him courage. Standing before Pharaoh, he spoke the words God had given him, "Let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's face hardened like stone. He laughed at Moses and refused. Instead of releasing the Israelites, he made their labor even harsher, thinking he could crush their hope. But God had not sent Moses alone. Through Moses and Aaron, God began to show his power over the might of Egypt, sending signs that no magician or false god could match. First came the plague of blood. The waters of the Nile turned red, undrinkable, and filled with death. Yet Pharaoh's heart stayed hard. Then came frogs, filling every corner of the land. They covered the floors of homes, the beds of the people, even Pharaoh's palace. He begged for relief, but as soon as God removed them, he hardened his heart again. After the frogs came gnats, tiny but relentless, swarming every man and beast. Then came flies, thick as clouds, corrupting the air and bringing misery to every Egyptian home. Still, Pharaoh would not let God's people go. The plagues grew stronger. Disease swept over the livestock, and the proud herds of Egypt lay still in the fields. Then painful boils broke out on the skin of Pharaoh's people, and even his magicians could not stand before him. But his heart remained unmoved. Next, a hailstorm unlike any before fell from the sky, shattering crops, trees, and homes. After the hail, locusts came, devouring every green thing left in Egypt. And when the land seemed as ruined as it could be, God sent darkness, a heavy, suffocating blackness that lasted for 3 days. In all these things, God's people in Goshen were safe. Pharaoh tried to bargain to control the terms of freedom, but he never relented fully. And then God told Moses of the final plague, the one that would break Egypt's pride. On that night, every Israelite household was to take a lamb without blemish, sacrifice it, and mark their doorposts with its blood. Inside, they were to eat the lamb with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, ready to leave at a moment's notice. God said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." And so, as midnight came, a cry rose throughout Egypt like none before. Every firstborn in the land, from the house of Pharaoh to the poorest family, died that night. But where the blood marked the doors, there was safety. This became known as the Passover. In his grief and terror, Pharaoh finally summoned Moses and Aaron in the night. "Go," he said. "Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and bless me also." The Israelites left in haste, carrying with them bread that had no time to rise. They went out with the riches of Egypt, given freely by the people who longed to see them go. After 430 years in Egypt, the children of Israel walked out, free at last, their hearts lifted by the promise of God. Moses led them as God guided, with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. The wilderness stretched ahead, and though their freedom was new and uncertain, every step was a step toward the land God had promised to their fathers. As they began their journey, they carried more than belongings. They carried a story of a God who hears, who sees, and who rescues his people with a mighty hand. It was the beginning of a long road, but for the first time, the chains of Egypt were behind them. And so, with the taste of unleavened bread on their lips and the wind of the desert in their faces, the people of Israel set out, not knowing every turn of the path ahead, but knowing this: the God who brought them out would not leave them. Chapter 11. The Red Sea and the Wilderness, God's Provision. The Israelites had left Egypt in haste, hearts still racing from the events of the Passover night. But as they camped by the Red Sea, a sudden terror came upon them. Pharaoh, filled with regret and anger, had gathered his chariots and soldiers, determined to bring them back. Dust rose behind the approaching army, and the people cried out in fear. Moses stood firm, though the people's voices were full of panic. "Why did you bring us here to die?" they shouted. But Moses raised his staff and spoke with calm authority. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." "The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." God answered. That night, a pillar of cloud moved between the Israelites and the Egyptian army, creating a wall of darkness on one side and light on the other. The sea before them seemed impossible to cross, but God gave his command. Moses stretched out his staff, and the waters began to part. The wind howled through the night, sweeping the waters aside until a path of dry land stretched out through the sea. Towering walls of water stood on either side as the people, trembling with awe, stepped forward. One by one, the Israelites walked across, lit by the glow of the pillar of fire, every footstep carrying them closer to safety. Behind them, Pharaoh's chariots gave chase, driving into the sea. But as the last of God's people reached the far shore, God told Moses to stretch out his hand once more. The waters crashed back into place, swallowing the Egyptian army. When the waves settled, silence filled the air. The Israelites were safe. On the far shore, their fear turned to joy. Miriam, the sister of Moses, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with music and dancing. "Sing to the Lord," she sang, "for he is highly exalted. The horse and rider he has hurled into the sea." Their voices rose in a chorus of freedom. But freedom also led to the wilderness, where the journey became long and the provisions scarce. Days passed under the hot sun, and the people grew hungry and thirsty. Doubt began to whisper again, "Why did you bring us here to die?" God, faithful as always, answered their needs. One morning, as the dew lifted, they found something new scattered on the ground, thin flakes, white like frost. "What is it?" they asked each other. And Moses said, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." They called it manna. Every day they gathered what they needed, and on the sixth day they gathered double so they could rest on the Sabbath. It was a rhythm of trust, a daily reminder that their life was in God's hands. When thirst consumed them in the desert of Rephidim, and there was no water, the people grumbled again. Moses cried out to God, and God told him to strike a rock with his staff. Moses obeyed, and from the rock, fresh water gushed out, enough for everyone to drink. In these moments, God showed them that even in the harshest places, he could provide. They were never alone. His presence went with them always, a cloud by day that shielded them from the burning sun, and a pillar of fire by night to guide their path in the dark. This guidance became their constant companion. Whether they camped or journeyed, they followed the movement of the cloud. When it lifted, they walked. When it stayed, they rested. It was a visible sign that God was leading them himself. Through each hardship, the people began to see that their deliverance was not just from Pharaoh, but from fear itself. God was shaping them, teaching them to rely on him, step by step, through the wilderness. The Red Sea had been their first great victory, but the wilderness was where their hearts learned to trust. With every mouthful of manna, every drop of water from the rock, they discovered the truth. God provides. And so, the people of Israel walked on, their eyes fixed on the cloud and the fire, carrying with them the memory of the sea that had parted, and the promise of the one who never left them. Chapter 12. The 10 Commandments, Laws from the Mountain. After weeks of traveling through the wilderness, the Israelites finally came to a vast and rocky plain at the base of a towering mountain called Sinai. Here, the cloud that had guided them came to rest, and God told Moses that this would be the place where he would speak to his people in a new way. The people set up camp, their tents stretching far and wide beneath the looming peak. God called Moses up to the mountain. There, amidst the silence, God said, "If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession out of all nations. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Moses came down and told the people these words, and with one voice they answered, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." On the third day the mountain itself seemed to awaken. Thunder rumbled across the sky, and flashes of lightning danced among the dark clouds that wrapped around the peak. A trumpet blast, long and loud, filled the air, and the people trembled. Smoke rose from the mountain like a furnace, for the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The people stood at the foot of the mountain, afraid to come closer. Even the ground beneath them shook. Moses alone was called to step forward into the thick darkness where God was. There, high above the camp, he entered the presence of the Lord. From the mountain, God spoke words that would shape his people forever. These were not suggestions or passing advice, they were commands. The Lord's voice declared, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet." These 10 commandments were a gift, a guide for how to live with God and with one another. The mountain still trembled as God spoke, and the people, overwhelmed by the sound and sight of his glory, begged Moses to speak to them instead, saying, "Do not let God speak to us directly, or we will die." Moses reassured them, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of him will keep you from sinning." And so Moses went back up the mountain to hear more from the Lord. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses stayed on the mountain. God gave him instructions not only for the commandments but also for building a place where his presence could dwell among them, a sanctuary. On tablets of stone, carved by the very hand of God, the 10 commandments were written. Meanwhile, down below, impatience and fear began to grow in the hearts of the people. They asked Aaron to make them a god they could see, and from their gold earrings, they fashioned a golden calf. They bowed to it, forgetting the God who had rescued them. When Moses came down the mountain and saw what they had done, he was filled with sorrow and anger. He smashed the tablets on the ground, their sound ringing like thunder through the camp. Then he burned the calf, ground it to powder, and called the people back to repentance. Moses went back to the mountain, heartbroken for his people. He prayed that God would forgive them, asking, "Please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." God, in his mercy, forgave them, but he warned them of the seriousness of their rebellion. God told Moses to cut 2 more tablets, and again he wrote the commandments with his own hand. Once more, God renewed his covenant, promising to be their God if they would follow him faithfully. When Moses came down from the mountain the second time, his face shone with light from being in God's presence. The people were afraid to come near him, but Moses reassured them, teaching them all that God had said. From that moment on, the 10 commandments became the foundation of their covenant with God, a promise that they would be his people, set apart to live in a way that reflected his holiness. And as the tablets rested in the Ark of the Covenant, carried with them wherever they went, they became a lasting reminder. God had spoken from the mountain, and his words would never be forgotten. Chapter 13. Joshua and the Promised Land, Courage and Obedience. After Moses died, the people of Israel stood on the edge of the Promised Land, their hearts full of both hope and uncertainty. God chose Joshua, Moses' faithful assistant, to lead them forward. To this new leader, God spoke words of strength and assurance. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joshua carried those words like a shield. He gathered the people, reminding them that the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was about to be fulfilled. Now was the time to trust God fully and step into the inheritance they had been waiting for all their lives. Their first challenge was the Jordan River. At flood stage, its waters were fierce and deep, but God gave Joshua clear instructions. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant were to step into the river first. As soon as their feet touched the water, the flow stopped. The people watched in awe as the mighty Jordan piled up in a heap far upstream. The riverbed dried before their eyes, and the entire nation crossed over on dry ground, just as their parents had once crossed the Red Sea. When all had passed safely, Joshua commanded them to take 12 stones from the river and set them up as a memorial of what God had done. On the other side of the river lay Jericho, a city with walls so high and strong they seemed impossible to breach. Yet God did not call Joshua to use swords or siege engines. Instead, God gave an unusual command: march around the city once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, march around 7 times. Then blow the trumpets and shout, and the walls will fall. The people obeyed. Day after day, they walked silently around Jericho's walls, while the inhabitants looked down in confusion and fear. On the 7th day, after the final lap, the priests blew their trumpets, and the people shouted with all their might. Suddenly, the walls of Jericho collapsed. Stones tumbled, dust rose, and the path into the city was wide open. The victory belonged not to their strength but to God's power, and Jericho was delivered into their hands. From there, the Israelites pressed on, battle after battle. God went before them, and wherever they followed his instructions, victory was certain. Little by little, the land that had been promised became theirs. Joshua reminded the people that obedience was their strength. It was not numbers or weapons that secured their future. It was trust in the Lord. And as they claimed more land, they returned often to Gilgal, where the stones from the Jordan stood as a sign of God's faithfulness. After the land had been subdued, Joshua oversaw its division among the 12 tribes of Israel. Each family received an inheritance, a place to call home in the land flowing with milk and honey. Cities were built, vineyards were planted, and life began to take root. Joshua gathered all the people together and reminded them of all God had done, delivering them from Egypt, leading them through the wilderness, stopping the Jordan, and breaking down the walls of Jericho. With deep conviction, he called them to remain faithful. "Choose this day whom you will serve," Joshua said, his voice steady and clear. "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The people responded with one heart, "We will serve the Lord." They renewed their covenant, promising to walk in obedience and to keep the law that Moses had given them. In the days that followed, the Israelites flourished in their new home. And though Joshua's time as their leader eventually came to an end, his courage and trust in God left a legacy that echoed across generations. Through rivers and battles, Joshua's story stands as a reminder. When God makes a promise, he is faithful to keep it. And with him, no wall is too high and no river too wide. Chapter 14. The time of the judges, God raises deliverers. After Joshua's death, the people of Israel were left without a single leader to guide them. They had inherited the land God had promised, but their hearts began to wander. Little by little, they forgot the God who had parted seas and torn down walls. They turned to idols, choosing their own ways over his. Whenever they turned away, trouble came. Neighboring nations rose up against them, and Israel found themselves oppressed, their peace shattered. But in their suffering, they remembered God and cried out to him for help. And each time God, in his mercy, raised up a deliverer, a judge to rescue them. This was the pattern of those years: disobedience, oppression, and then, after repentance, deliverance. It was a cycle that repeated again and again, a testament to the weakness of human hearts and the steadfast patience of God. One of the first great deliverers was Deborah, a prophetess. When Israel was crushed under the power of a Canaanite king, God called Deborah to lead. She summoned Barak to command Israel's army, and with her wisdom and faith, God gave them victory. The enemy was defeated, and the people sang a song of triumph, praising the Lord. But peace never lasted long. After a time, the people forgot again, and another oppressor came. This time it was Midian, and they drove the Israelites to hide in caves, their crops destroyed and their spirits crushed. To deliver them, God called an unlikely man named Gideon. Gideon saw himself as the least in his family, and his family as the least in their tribe. But God saw something different. "I will be with you," the Lord told him, and that promise changed everything. Gideon gathered an army, but God reduced it from thousands to just 300 men. With only trumpets, torches, and clay jars, they surrounded the Midianite camp at night. At Gideon's signal, they blew their trumpets, smashed their jars, and shouted. Confusion swept through the enemy camp, and the Midianites fled without a battle. Once again, peace came, but again it faded, and the cycle began anew. This time, the Philistines rose as Israel's oppressors, and God raised up a deliverer named Samson. Samson was given great strength, a strength unlike any other, as long as he kept the vow God had placed upon his life. His battles against the Philistines became legendary, tearing apart lions with his bare hands, striking down enemies with the jawbone of a donkey. But Samson, like the people, struggled with weakness of heart. His strength could not keep him from the consequences of his own choices. Betrayed and captured, it seemed his story had ended. Yet, in his final act, Samson called upon God one last time. Pushing against the pillars of a great temple, he brought it crashing down upon the Philistines, striking a final blow against Israel's enemies. These stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson are only a few among many. Again and again, God raised up judges, men and women called to deliver his people when they turned back to him. But each time the people were rescued, they soon forgot. They turned from the God who had saved them, chasing after other gods, and the cycle began again. The time of the judges was full of highs and lows, victories and defeats. Through it all, one truth echoed: God was faithful, even when his people were not. His mercy answered their cries, and his power lifted them out of despair. This season of Israel's history reminds us of a deeper longing, a need for a savior who could break the cycle once and for all, not just rescuing them from their enemies, but rescuing their hearts. And so, as the time of the judges came to a close, the people began to cry out for a king. But God's story was not done yet. The next chapter of Israel's journey was about to unfold. Chapter 15. Ruth's story, loyalty, and redemption. In the days when the judges ruled, a famine swept through the land of Israel. Food was scarce and life was hard. A man named Elimelech took his wife Naomi and their 2 sons to the land of Moab, hoping to find a better life. For a time they settled there, far from their home in Bethlehem. But hardship followed them. Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Her 2 sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, but after 10 years, both sons also died. Naomi, now without her husband and her children, felt empty and alone. Hearing that the famine in Israel had ended, Naomi decided to return home to Bethlehem. She told her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, to return to their families, and begin new lives. Orpah wept, kissed Naomi goodbye, and stayed behind. But Ruth clung to Naomi with a loyalty that could not be shaken. "Do not urge me to leave you," Ruth said. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God." And so, together, Naomi and Ruth made the long journey back to Bethlehem. When they arrived, it was the beginning of the barley harvest, and the town buzzed with life. Naomi was bitter, grieving for all she had lost, but Ruth was determined to care for her. To provide for them, Ruth went to glean in the fields, picking up leftover grain after the harvesters had passed. She happened to find herself in the fields of a man named Boaz, a wealthy and respected man, who also happened to be a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz noticed Ruth. He had heard of her kindness and loyalty to Naomi, how she had left her own homeland to care for her mother-in-law. Impressed by her character, Boaz told Ruth to stay in his fields where she would be safe, and he made sure she had food and water. Day after day, Ruth returned to Boaz's fields, and every day, Boaz showed her kindness. Naomi, hearing all of this, realized that God's hand was at work. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, someone who had the right to redeem or restore the family line. Naomi guided Ruth on what to do. One evening, Ruth approached Boaz and humbly asked him to redeem their family, a request full of courage and respect. Boaz was deeply moved. He told Ruth that her loyalty and kindness had not gone unnoticed. There was another relative who was closer in line, and Boaz promised to speak to him first. If that man refused, Boaz himself would redeem her. True to his word, Boaz met with the other relative the next day. When the man declined, Boaz declared before the town elders that he would redeem Naomi's family and take Ruth as his wife. Ruth and Boaz were married, and their union was blessed with a son named Obed. Naomi, who had once called herself empty, now held her grandson in her arms, her heart full once again. This child, Obed, grew up to be the father of Jesse, who would be the father of King David. Through Ruth's loyalty and God's guiding hand, she became part of the family line that would one day lead to the Messiah. Ruth's story is one of quiet faithfulness, humble obedience, and redemption. From loss came new life, and from sorrow came hope. It reminds us that God's plans are often bigger than our own. Even in the most ordinary acts of kindness and loyalty, He weaves a story that changes the course of history. And so, in a small town called Bethlehem, a story of loyalty and redemption began. A story that would echo for generations to come. Chapter 16. Samuel and the kings Saul, David, and Solomon. In the days after the judges, the people of Israel longed for a leader who could unite them. They cried out for a king, but before this came to pass, God raised up a prophet named Samuel. From his childhood, Samuel had heard God's voice. As a boy, serving in the tabernacle, he was called in the quiet of the night. "Samuel," God said, and the boy answered, "Speak, for your servant is listening." As Samuel grew, he became a faithful prophet, guiding the people back to God. Yet, the people continued to demand a king so they could be like the nations around them. Though God warned them of the burdens a king would bring, he allowed it. Samuel anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. At first, Saul led with promise. He gathered the tribes, defended the people, and seemed to be chosen for greatness. But over time, his heart turned. He disobeyed God's commands, acting out of fear rather than faith. One of the turning points came when Saul offered a sacrifice that only the prophet was meant to give. He grew impatient, and his choice revealed a deeper problem. Saul trusted his own judgment over God's instructions. Because of this disobedience, God told Samuel that Saul's kingdom would not last. The Lord had chosen another, someone after his own heart, to lead his people. That someone was a shepherd boy named David, the youngest son of Jesse of Bethlehem. Samuel traveled to Bethlehem and, by God's guidance, anointed David in secret. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward, though years would pass before he became king. David first came into Saul's court as a musician, playing the harp to soothe the troubled king. Later, he stepped onto the battlefield and faced the giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone. With faith in God, David struck the Philistine and won a victory that caused his name to be known throughout Israel. As David's fame grew, Saul's jealousy grew as well. Fear and envy poisoned Saul's heart. Though David was loyal, Saul pursued him through the wilderness, trying to end his life. David refused to harm Saul even when given the chance. He trusted God's timing, believing that it was the Lord who raised up kings and brought them down. In time, Saul's life came to a tragic end on the battlefield. After his death, the tribes of Israel turned to David. Anointed once more, David became king over all Israel, uniting the nation and bringing strength to its borders. David was not without fault. He stumbled and fell, but his heart remained open to God's correction. He wrote songs of worship and lament, psalms that still guide hearts today. Under his reign, Israel flourished, and Jerusalem became its heart. After David, his son Solomon became king. God appeared to Solomon in a dream and asked what he desired. Instead of riches or power, Solomon asked for wisdom to lead his people well. Pleased with this request, God granted Solomon wisdom unlike anyone before him. Under Solomon's reign, Israel entered an era of peace and prosperity. Solomon's greatest work was building the temple in Jerusalem. With care and splendor, he created a place for God's presence to dwell among his people. A permanent house of worship where sacrifices and prayers would rise like incense. Thus, the era of kings began. A time of great victories and great failures, but always a reminder that true kingship belongs to God alone. Through Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon, God shaped a nation, preparing the way for a greater king who was yet to come. Chapter 17. David the Shepherd King, Psalms and Praise. Long before he was a king, David was a shepherd boy in the hills of Bethlehem. His days were simple but full of purpose. He guided his father's sheep through green pastures and across rocky slopes, protecting them from danger. Out there, beneath the wide-open skies, David learned to trust God. When wild animals came, lions or bears, he fought them off with his sling and his staff, knowing that the Lord gave him strength. It was in those quiet fields that David's heart was shaped. The solitude became a place of worship. With his harp, he would sing songs to God, lyrics born from the rhythm of his steps and the beauty of creation around him. These moments, unseen by others, were the seeds of the Psalms that would one day comfort countless generations. As a young man, David's courage was revealed in the valley where a giant named Goliath taunted the armies of Israel. While soldiers trembled, David's faith stood firm. He stepped forward with nothing but a sling and stones, declaring that the battle belonged to the Lord. And with a single, well-aimed stone, the giant fell. This victory marked the beginning of David's rise, but his heart remained humble. Even when he was praised and celebrated, he never forgot the fields where he first learned to rely on God's strength rather than his own. Throughout his life, David poured out his soul in songs and prayers. His psalms tell of joy and sorrow, of fear and hope. Some were written in triumph, celebrating God's deliverance. Others came from the depths of despair, when enemies surrounded him, or when guilt pressed heavy on his heart. David's relationship with God was honest. He did not hide his failures or his pain. Instead, he brought everything, his victories and defeats, to the Lord. His psalms became a language of the heart, teaching others how to pray with sincerity. Even as king, David never stopped being a worshiper. He danced before the Ark of the Covenant as it was brought into Jerusalem, unashamed to express his joy in the presence of the Lord. He led his people not just with authority, but with an example of devotion. David's life was not without sin. There were times when his choices brought great pain to himself and to others. Yet when he was confronted with his wrong, David's response was repentance. He sought God's mercy with a broken and contrite heart, and God forgave him. This humility is why Scripture calls him a man after God's own heart. It was not perfection that defined David. It was his desire to seek God, even in the midst of failure. His psalms became a sanctuary for future generations. Words like, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," and "Create in me a clean heart, O God," have echoed through the ages, offering comfort and guidance to those who read them. David's life as a shepherd stayed with him even as king. He saw himself as one who led, but also as one who was led, always under the care of the great shepherd. In times of war, he prayed for protection. In times of peace, he sang of thanksgiving. When he sinned, he cried out for forgiveness. His heart's song covered every season of life. The legacy David left was not only a kingdom but a testament that true strength is found in worship, and true greatness comes from a heart that loves God above all else. Even centuries later, David's psalms continue to lift weary souls, pointing them to the same God who watched over a young shepherd boy on the hills of Bethlehem. David, the shepherd king, showed the world that while crowns and victories fade, a heart turned toward God remains forever. And through his lineage, God's promise would one day bring forth a greater king, the son of David, who would fulfill all the hopes David sang about in his Psalms. Chapter 18. Solomon's Wisdom, a Golden Era. After the reign of David came his son Solomon, chosen by God to continue the royal line. When Solomon became king, he was still young, and the weight of ruling a great nation pressed heavily on him. One night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon could have asked for riches, long life, or the defeat of his enemies. But instead, with a humble heart, he asked for wisdom, to govern God's people with understanding and justice. This request pleased the Lord so much that he not only gave Solomon unmatched wisdom, but also blessed him with wealth and honor beyond any other king of his time. From that moment, Solomon's wisdom became renowned throughout the world. Leaders and rulers from distant lands came to hear his judgments and counsel. His ability to discern truth was legendary, and his words brought peace and order to Israel. One of the most famous stories of Solomon's wisdom was when two women came to him, both claiming to be the mother of the same baby. Solomon listened carefully and then proposed to cut the child in two, giving half to each woman. The real mother, overcome with love, cried out to give the baby to the other woman to save his life. In that moment, Solomon knew who the true mother was. With wisdom also came great prosperity. Under Solomon's leadership, Israel entered its golden age. Trade routes flourished, treasures poured into Jerusalem, and the nation became known far and wide for its wealth and influence. Silver and gold became as common as stones in the streets. Peace filled the land. Unlike the days of constant war that marked his father's reign, Solomon's rule was one of rest from enemies. The people lived in safety, enjoying the fruits of their labor, and the nation thrived. But Solomon's greatest achievement was the building of the temple, a dream his father David had carried but was not permitted to fulfill. Solomon gathered cedar from Lebanon, stone cut by skilled craftsmen, and gold for adornment. Thousands of workers labored for years, constructing a house worthy of God's glory. When the temple was finished, it shone like no other building. Its walls gleamed with gold, its carvings detailed with beauty, and its courts were vast and majestic. But even its splendor was only a reflection of the God for whom it was built. The day came for its dedication. People from every tribe gathered in Jerusalem, and the Ark of the Covenant, the sign of God's presence, was brought into the most holy place. Priests and singers praised God with instruments and voices, and a thick cloud filled the temple as the glory of the Lord descended. Solomon stood before the altar and prayed a heartfelt prayer. He asked God to hear the prayers of his people, to forgive when they turned back to him, and to make the temple a place where his name would dwell forever. When he finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple so strongly that no one could enter. The people fell to their knees, worshiping and giving thanks, saying, "He is good. His love endures forever." That day marked a turning point in Israel's story. The temple became the center of worship and a symbol of God's promise to dwell among his people. Under Solomon's reign, Israel reached its peak, a time of wealth, peace, and influence unmatched in its history. His writings, including proverbs and songs, offered insight on how to live with wisdom and honor before God. Yet even in this golden era, the people were reminded that their true strength was not in their riches or buildings, but in their trust in the Lord who had given them all these blessings. The era of Solomon was a glimpse of what it looked like when God's people lived in harmony under his guidance, a foretaste of an even greater kingdom that was still to come. Chapter 19. The Divided Kingdom, Prophets, and Kings. After Solomon's death, the peace and unity of Israel began to unravel. The kingdom that had once been united under David and Solomon was now torn apart by pride and conflict. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, refused wise counsel and chose harshness over compassion, and the people revolted. The once great nation split into two, the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. In the north, Jeroboam became king. He feared that if his people continued traveling to Jerusalem in Judah to worship, their loyalty would shift back. So he built golden calves and told the people, "Here are your gods." These idols became a stumbling block, leading the people away from the one true God. Judah, in the south, remained under the line of David, but even there the people's hearts began to drift. Though there were some kings who tried to honor the Lord, many others allowed sin to creep in, turning the nation away from God's ways. Idolatry spread like wildfire. High places and altars to false gods appeared on hills and under trees. The people forgot the covenant that had made them strong. They chose to worship what their hands had made instead of the God who had formed them. In his mercy, God did not abandon them. He sent prophets, men and women with a fire in their voices and a message that could not be silenced. Elijah, with courage as fierce as the desert wind, stood before kings and called them to repent. Elijah's successor, Elisha, performed miracles and showed the power of God to a nation that had forgotten him. And others, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, were raised up, each with a warning, a plea, and a promise. The message was always the same: return. Return to the Lord, for only in him was there life. The prophets spoke of God's love and his longing for his people, but they also warned of judgment if they continued in rebellion. But the kings of Israel, for the most part, hardened their hearts. They trusted in armies, alliances, and idols instead of the living God. Their pride blinded them, and their choices brought suffering to their people. In Judah, there were moments of revival. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah tore down idols and restored the temple, reminding the people of their heritage. Yet even these bright moments were short-lived, and the cycle of forgetting began again. As years passed, both kingdoms experienced wars, famines, and unrest. The prophets stood as beacons of truth, urging the people to remember who they were and to whom they belonged. The northern kingdom of Israel, after generations of disobedience, fell first. The Assyrian Empire swept in like a storm, conquering their cities and scattering the people. The land that had once been filled with the songs of God's people now echoed with silence. Judah watched and did not learn. Though they saw what happened to their brothers in Israel, their hearts did not fully turn back. They thought themselves safe because Jerusalem still stood, but the warnings of the prophets grew louder. Jeremiah wept for the people. Isaiah painted visions of both judgment and hope, speaking of a Messiah who would one day come. Even as the darkness deepened, there was always a thread of promise that God would not abandon his plan. The story of the divided kingdom was a story of God's faithfulness in the face of human failure. It was a story of his relentless love, calling his people to turn from empty idols and come home. Though the kingdom was divided, God's heart was not. He was still watching, still longing, still working through his prophets to prepare the way for the one who would one day bring true unity, not just to a nation but to the world. Chapter 20. Elijah and Elisha, miracles and messages. In the days when kings ruled the divided kingdoms, wickedness spread across Israel. One of the darkest reigns came under King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. They turned the hearts of the people to worship Baal, a false god, building altars to him and mocking the God of heaven. Into this chaos, God sent a prophet named Elijah, whose very name meant, "My God is the Lord." Elijah stood boldly before Ahab and delivered a message that shook the nation. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. With that, a great drought began. Rivers dried up, fields turned to dust, and the land groaned under the weight of famine. God was calling his people to wake up, to see that Baal had no power over the skies. Even during this harsh time, God cared for his servant. He led Elijah to a hidden brook and commanded ravens to bring him bread and meat every day. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath. Though she had only a handful of flour and a little oil left, Elijah told her to bake a small loaf for him first. Trusting his words, she did so, and her jar of flour and jug of oil never ran empty until the rains came again. But the drought continued for years, and the people's hearts remained hard. So God sent Elijah to challenge the prophets of Baal. On Mount Carmel, a great showdown began. 2 altars were prepared, one for Baal and one for the Lord. The people watched as Elijah spoke. The God who answers by fire, he is God. From morning until evening, the prophets of Baal cried out, danced, and even cut themselves, but there was no answer. Then Elijah, confident in the Lord, rebuilt the altar of God, poured water over it 3 times, and prayed, answer me, O Lord, so these people will know that you are God. Fire fell from heaven, so fierce it consumed not only the offering, but the stones and even the water in the trench. The crowd fell to the ground, crying, the Lord, he is God. That day, the false prophets were defeated, and the power of the living God was displayed for all to see. Soon after, the rains returned to the land. Yet Elijah's journey did not end there. After these mighty acts, he faced moments of fear and weakness. Fleeing from Jezebel's threats, he hid in the wilderness, weary and discouraged. But in that lonely place, God met him, not with wind, earthquake, or fire, but with a gentle whisper. It was a reminder that God's strength is not always shown in force, but in quiet presence. Elijah continued to serve, performing miracles that showed God's faithfulness. Multiplying food for the hungry, raising a widow's son from death, and anointing kings as God directed. His life became a living message that God was still at work, even in dark times. Then came the moment when God chose a successor for Elijah. A young man named Elisha, found plowing in a field. Elijah threw his cloak over him, a sign that the calling of a prophet had passed to him. From that day, Elisha left everything behind to follow and serve. When the time came for Elijah to leave the earth, the 2 prophets walked together to the Jordan River. Elisha, knowing his master's departure was near, refused to leave his side. At the river's edge, Elijah struck the water with his cloak, and the waters parted, allowing them to cross on dry ground. On the other side, Elijah asked, what can I do for you before I am taken from you? Elisha answered, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. It was a bold request, but one God honored. As they walked, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, and Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha cried out in grief, but when he picked up Elijah's fallen cloak and struck the river, the waters parted again. It was clear that the mantle of God's power now rested on him. Elisha's life became a continuation of the miracles and messages of Elijah. Through him, God healed the sick, multiplied oil for the poor, made poisoned food safe to eat, and even raised the dead. These signs reminded Israel that God was still present and still calling them to trust him. The stories of Elijah and Elisha are stories of courage and faithfulness in times of darkness. They remind us that God's power can overcome any falsehood. His whisper can strengthen weary hearts, and his presence continues, even when the world seems far from him. And as the prophets passed their message from one to another, the call remained the same. Return to the Lord, for he alone is God. Chapter 21. Isaiah's vision promises of the Messiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, the prophet Isaiah found himself in the temple of the Lord. What he saw that day would change his life forever. In a moment, the ordinary became extraordinary. The temple was filled with smoke, and high above, Isaiah saw the Lord seated on a throne, his robe filling the entire space. Around him were seraphim, angelic beings with 6 wings, calling out to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." The sound of their voices shook the very foundations of the temple. Isaiah could only fall to his knees. "Woe to me!" he cried. "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." One of the seraphim flew to him, carrying a live coal from the altar with tongs. With that coal, the angel touched Isaiah's lips and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." In that moment, the weight of shame lifted, replaced by awe and grace. Then came the voice of God himself. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Isaiah, trembling yet now purified, answered, "Here am I, send me." That day, Isaiah was called to be a prophet, a messenger of both judgment and hope to God's people. His mission would not be easy. God told him that the people's hearts would be hard. They would listen but not understand, see but not perceive. Still, Isaiah was to deliver God's word faithfully, planting seeds of truth that would one day bloom. Through Isaiah, God spoke first of judgment. Israel and Judah had turned away from their God. They worshipped idols, oppressed the poor, and ignored justice. Isaiah's words were sharp, calling kings and people alike to repent. His warning spoke of cities left in ruins and lands stripped bare, like a tree cut down until only a stump remained. Yet even in judgment, God offered a promise. That stump, lifeless as it seemed, would one day sprout again. Out of devastation, new life would come. A holy seed remained, hidden in the roots. Isaiah spoke of hope that went beyond the pain of his present day. He described a time when God's people would be restored, their sins forgiven, their hearts made new. He told of a servant chosen by God, one who would bring justice not by force, but with gentleness, carrying the light of salvation to the ends of the earth. One of Isaiah's most extraordinary prophecies was about a child. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. This child would be a sign of God's promise, a light shining in the darkness. He went on, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." These words painted a picture of a ruler unlike any the world had known, a king of peace whose reign would never end. Isaiah also spoke of the suffering that this coming Savior would endure. "He was pierced for our transgressions," he said. "He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." The servant of the Lord would take upon himself the sins of the people, offering mercy and redemption. Even as Isaiah delivered words of rebuke, he offered these visions like a light on the horizon. They gave comfort to a weary nation and pointed to a future filled with grace. The prophet reminded them that God's thoughts are higher than their thoughts, his ways higher than their ways. Just as rain waters the earth and does not return empty, so too would God's word accomplish its purpose. Isaiah's visions were not only for his time. They echoed across the centuries, preparing the way for the Messiah who would one day come. His words became a promise that God had not forgotten his people, and that the brokenness of this world would one day be healed. And as Isaiah walked away from that first vision in the temple, he carried with him a mission: to speak God's truth no matter the cost, and to hold out the hope of the one who was coming, the Savior, the Redeemer, the Prince of Peace. Chapter 22. The Exile and Return. Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah. The glory of Jerusalem had faded. Kings and prophets had warned for generations, but the people turned again and again to idols. And at last, the day of judgment came. The mighty armies of Babylon marched through the gates, breaking down the walls of the holy city. The temple, once filled with the presence of God, was torn apart stone by stone. Smoke filled the sky as the people of Judah were taken far from their home, carried away into exile. Among these exiles were young men of courage and faith, like Daniel. Far from Jerusalem, they were placed in the courts of the Babylonian king, taught the ways of a foreign land. Yet Daniel and his friends refused to forget who they were. They would not eat the rich foods offered to idols, choosing instead the simple diet that honored God. Their obedience, even in small things, became the foundation of their strength. Years passed, and Babylon's kings dreamed dreams they could not understand. Daniel, with wisdom given by God, was called to interpret them. Again and again, he spoke with courage, telling rulers of empires that it is the Most High who sets up kings and brings them down. His faith shone like a steady light in a world of pride and power. Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were tested too. Ordered to bow before a golden statue, they stood firm. "We will not serve your gods," they said, even though a fiery furnace waited for them. Thrown into the flames, they walked unharmed, protected by a fourth figure, one who looked like a son of the gods. Later, Daniel himself faced the king's decree forbidding prayer to anyone but the ruler. Yet he opened his window toward Jerusalem and prayed as he always had. For this, he was thrown into a den of lions. But in the stillness of the night, God sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths. When the king came at dawn, he found Daniel alive, a living sign of God's power to save. Through these stories, the people of Israel learned that God had not abandoned them, even in exile. His presence was not bound to a place, but with his people wherever they were. 70 long years passed. Kingdoms rose and fell. And then, under a new ruler, the Persian king Cyrus, something miraculous happened. God stirred the king's heart, and he issued a decree. The exiled people could return home. They were free to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple of the Lord. Ezra, a priest and teacher of the law, led one group back. They arrived in a city of ruins, with crumbled walls and burned gates. Yet hope returned with every step they took. Their first act was to rebuild the altar, offering sacrifices once again to the God who had never left them. Stone by stone, the foundation of the temple was laid. When the people saw it, they wept, some with joy, others with sorrow. Though the new temple was not as grand as the first, it marked a new beginning. God's presence among his people had not been lost, but the work was not finished. Years later, Nehemiah, a servant in the Persian court, heard about Jerusalem's broken walls. His heart ached for his homeland. He prayed, and God gave him favor with the king, who allowed him to return and rebuild the city's defenses. When Nehemiah arrived, he found opposition at every turn. Enemies mocked and threatened him, trying to stop the work. Yet he and the people built with one hand while holding a weapon in the other. In just 52 days, the walls of Jerusalem rose again, a sign that God's hand was with them. Once the walls were complete, the people gathered to hear the words of the law. Ezra stood before them, reading from the scroll. As the words filled the air, the people listened, and their hearts were pierced. They wept over their sins, but they also celebrated. They had been brought back, not just to a city, but to their God. The exiles had come home. Though their land bore scars and their city still carried the memory of loss, they knew something deeper. God's mercy endures. He restores. And so the chapter of exile closed, but its lessons remained. That even in a foreign land, God is faithful. That from ruins he can rebuild. And that his promises are not broken by distance, time, or sorrow. In the quiet of Jerusalem's rebuilt streets, a whisper of hope could be heard. The story of God's people was not over. A greater redemption was still to come. Chapter 23. Esther's courage for such a time as this. In the days after the return from exile, many of God's people still lived in faraway lands under the rule of mighty Persia. Among them was a young Jewish woman named Hadassah, though she was known by her Persian name, Esther. She lived with her cousin Mordecai, who had raised her after her parents died. Quiet, kind, and beautiful, She had no idea how God was weaving her story into something extraordinary. In the royal court of Persia, a search began. The king Xerxes sought a new queen. From every corner of the empire, young women were brought to the palace. And among them was Esther. Though she was just one among many, there was something about her grace and humility that caught the attention of everyone who saw her. When her turn came to meet the king, he was so captivated by her that he placed the royal crown upon her head. Esther, a humble orphan, was now queen of Persia, but she kept a secret close to her heart, as Mordecai had told her. No one was to know she was Jewish. Not long after, a man named Haman rose to power in the king's court. Proud and cruel, he demanded that all bow down to him. But Mordecai refused, choosing instead to bow only to God. This angered Haman deeply. When he learned Mordecai was a Jew, his anger burned even hotter. He convinced the king to sign a decree that on a certain day, all the Jews in the empire would be destroyed. News of this decree spread like wildfire, and mourning swept through the Jewish people. Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, standing outside the palace, weeping. When Esther heard of it, she sent a messenger to ask what had happened. Mordecai's reply was simple but heavy. She must go to the king and plead for their lives. But Esther was afraid. In Persia, no one could approach the king without being summoned, not even the queen. To enter uninvited could mean death unless the king extended his golden scepter. "If I perish, I perish," she said at last, summoning all her courage. She asked Mordecai to gather the Jews to fast and pray for 3 days. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes. With a pounding heart, she stepped into the king's court. Silence fell as she approached. The king looked at her and, moved with favor, held out his scepter. She was safe. She had been given her chance to speak. Instead of making her request immediately, Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet. There, she invited them again to a second banquet the next day. Haman left full of pride, never knowing the trap that God was setting. That night, the king could not sleep. To pass the hours, he asked for the royal records to be read aloud. In them, he heard again the story of how Mordecai had once uncovered a plot to kill him, and realized Mordecai had never been rewarded. The next morning, the king ordered Haman to honor Mordecai publicly, forcing the proud man to parade the very one he hated through the streets. At the second banquet, the moment came. The king asked Esther, "What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." With calm and courage, Esther spoke. "If I have found favor with you, let my life be spared, and the lives of my people, for we have been sold for destruction." Shocked, the king demanded to know who would do such a thing. Esther pointed to Haman. "This enemy." In a single day, everything changed. Haman was taken away, and a new decree was written, allowing the Jews to defend themselves. When the appointed day came, instead of being destroyed, the Jewish people were saved. The story of Esther became a story of God's quiet providence. Though his name is never spoken in the book, his hand is seen in every detail. In the sleepless night of a king, in the courage of a young queen, and in the deliverance of an entire people. From that day forward, the Jewish people celebrated the Feast of Purim, remembering how God had saved them for such a time as this. Esther's courage, born from faith, became a legacy that still whispers through history, that even in the darkest times, God places people exactly where they need to be. And so, the exiles learned again what they had been learning all along. God's promises never fail, and his plans always prevail, even in the most unlikely of places. Chapter 24. The Silent Years, Waiting in Darkness. After the time of Esther and the prophets, there came a stretch of history that felt unlike anything before. For 400 long years, there were no prophets speaking God's word, no visions, no fresh revelations. The heavens, it seemed, were silent. Generations came and went, passing stories down from parent to child. The creation of the world, the flood, the promise to Abraham, the rescue from Egypt, the prophets who spoke of a coming Messiah. They held tightly to these promises, even as the world around them changed. The people of Israel lived under foreign rulers, first the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. Kingdom after kingdom rose and fell. The language of the land shifted. Roads were built, cities expanded, armies marched. Yet the people of God waited. In that waiting, the longing for a Savior only grew stronger. They whispered about the words of Isaiah, who had promised that a child would be born, a son given, and his name would be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. They clung to the hope of a king from the line of David, one who would bring justice and peace, who would make things right. The more the world pressed in with its chaos, the more their hearts longed for this coming king. But in those years, the voice of prophecy did not break the stillness. No new messenger came forward to say, "Thus says the Lord." Instead, it seemed as though creation itself held its breath, waiting. Still, God was at work even in the silence. The stage of history was being set. The roads built by Rome would one day carry the good news of the gospel across nations. The Greek language, now spoken widely, would allow those words to be understood far and wide. In the hearts of the faithful, God was preparing a people who would recognize him when he came, not with armies, but with love. The silence was not absence. It was preparation. During these centuries, teachers of the law rose to prominence, creating schools and synagogues where the scriptures were read aloud. The people gathered, week after week, to hear the ancient words, to remember who they were and who their God had promised to be. The longing deepened. Mothers told their children that one day the Messiah would come. Fathers prayed for his arrival as they worked the fields. At night, families would look up at the stars, wondering if perhaps tomorrow would be the day. Empires continued to come and go, their power rising like waves, then breaking. Yet through it all, Israel's hope endured. In those silent centuries, the world experienced darkness, but not without a promise of light. People searched for meaning in philosophies, power, and wealth, but none of it satisfied. Something greater was coming. And then, just when the waiting felt endless, the fullness of time drew near. In the silence, God had been weaving every thread together, preparing to step into his creation in a way no one could have imagined. The silent years were not wasted years. They were a prelude, the darkness before the dawn. And soon, the dawn would break, not with thunder, but with the cry of a baby born in Bethlehem. And so, the story pauses, but it doesn't end. The journey through the Old Testament is only the beginning, a path paved with promise, pointing to redemption still to come. If this brought you peace tonight, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below, and let's keep growing this beautiful community together. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more peaceful nights and more stories from God's Word. Until next time, sleep well and God bless you.